It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Melissa Cardon, professor at University of Tennessee. Dr. Cardon received her PhD from Columbia University. She does research on psychology of entrepreneurs as they found, persist, and succeed or not. And that's an important thing in entrepreneurship, success or failure with their ventures. She has the credit of popularizing the study of entrepreneurial passion, also studies emotions, persistence, stress, burnout, exhaustion, and exit from entrepreneurship. She's associate editor at Journal of Management, sits on the editorial board of several journals, including AMR and AT&P, Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice. With that, let me welcome Dr. Cardon to the session. Thank you, Melissa, for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm delighted to be part of this conversation today with all of you.
Thank you, Melissa. I'll start with the first few questions, and then we'll open up the floor to students, to our participants for questions. And my first question is pretty straightforward. How did you get interested in entrepreneurship research? What's your background? I don't think most of us grow up thinking, when we are 10 or 12 years of age, I'm going to become an entrepreneurship researcher someday.
Yeah, absolutely. So strangely enough, it did actually start, not that I wanted to do this, but my father founded a business when I was 7 years old. And he grew that business. It went through the normal cycles of good times and not so good times, breakups with partners. My mom worked in the business for a while and exited at some point. And I watched all of this firsthand as a child growing up in that household. He ran it for over 20 years before he sold it long after I became an adult. So that was my first fascination with entrepreneurship. My brother's an entrepreneur, my sister's an entrepreneur. That was never my path. I've always been drawn to teaching. So even in middle school and high school, I was a tutor for other individuals, everything from math to cello lessons. I used to be a classical cellist, long time ago. And so after I earned my PhD, I went into corporate America. I worked in human resources for years, training and development, as well as some other aspects of HR, and ultimately decided that the corporate lifestyle was not for me. I wanted to be in the academic world. And so I went back to school to get my PhD. I initially started studying human resources, not in entrepreneurial firms, but my advisor, my first few years, was a woman named Rita McGrath, who is a very famous entrepreneurship research scholar now and more of a consultant now, writes a lot of books. But I started studying HR and entrepreneurial firms. And then ultimately, after I became a faculty member, started studying emotions of entrepreneurs.
Okay. And you've pioneered the study of passion and in entrepreneurship research. I do work on gender, as you know. There's not many women scholars we credit as being founding mothers, but I guess that's how I would describe you, as being founding mother of entrepreneurial passion research. So what can you share with us some insights you have on the past, present, and future of passion and emotions research in entrepreneurship?
Yeah, and so I want to start by saying it's accidental that I founded, I guess, Norris Kruger calls me the queen of passion. I think that has a few more things that come with that don't sound so nice, but I think the founding mother sounds better. So I had a junior faculty member. I was a year into my faculty life, and a sales marketing professor came to me and he said, I need help. I need to understand sales individuals, and sales individuals, particularly those that sell pharmaceutical medicines. I don't understand how they do what they do, but I think they're like entrepreneurs. They keep going to doctors' offices and asking them to prescribe their medications. They keep getting told no, but somehow they're still super excited and motivated to do what they do. Well, that's entrepreneurs, right? They keep getting told no, they beat their head against the wall, they face constant failure risk. How do they do what they do? And I said, quite flippantly at the time, yeah, they're passionate, they can't help themselves. And he laughed. He said, that's not a thing. Passion isn't a construct, it doesn't exist, and that's just not worthy of scientific study. And I've never been one to shy away from a challenge. I guess that's my father's entrepreneurialism in me. And so I said, well, let's go find out. So we went and interviewed a number of entrepreneurs and said, why do you do what you do? How do you deal with the risk of failure? How do you deal with actual failure? How do you get back up, dust yourself off, and keep going? And every single one of them, unprompted, said passion. And so we started reading everything we could get our hands on to understand, what does that mean? What does that mean to entrepreneurs? What does that mean in the literature? Where can we draw from to try to understand this construct? For me, it was accidental to come into the field, specifically the construct. But I think the whole area of emotions was also not something that was talked about when I did my PhD. So my first big research conference was 1999. Yes, I'm old. It was the Babson College Entrepreneurship Research Conference, and everybody there was presenting about strategy and economics and finance. And I was kind of like, this is not my field, except for one guy named Robert Barron. I assume everybody knows that name at this point, whether you're a student or not, because he is truly a founder of the psychology of entrepreneurship, along with Michael Friese and Robert Baum also. Robert got up and started saying, we need to study the individual. We need to understand their motivations and their drive and their emotions. And so I credit Robert Barron with opening the door to me to say, this is a valid research stream. This is something we can talk about. And combine that with the story of the senior marketing faculty member that wanted to understand passion. And that's where it came from for me. I think the field's exploded. So you asked, where's the field going? It's exploded. The number of papers we see now at conferences on emotions broadly, passion specifically, is huge. I think it's like 600% growth since the 2009 AMR paper came out, which is just remarkable. I'll also credit Dean Shepard because of his work on grief, and his first AMR came out on that in 2003. And so you see that sort of the middle 2000s, early 2000s, 2000 and 2010, where everybody started saying, these are human beings and we need to understand more about that. And I think the future is wide open.
See, and what really I find interesting here is even in grief's, even in Shepard's paper on grief, he talks about how his father's business failure led him to study grief in entrepreneurs, or at least motivated him. And you talk about sort of how your father's entrepreneurship experience sort of drove your interest in entrepreneurship. So that's interesting. Now, what do you think are some opportunities and problems in the study of emotions or passions in entrepreneurship?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity. I think there are challenges. And the challenges, a couple. So you mentioned I've been on editorial boards. I'm an incoming editor at AMR this summer, which is a new challenge for me. But I think we're seeing a lot of incremental work in the field. And Vishal, you and I have spoken about this individually before, where I think we're getting a lot of people that say, let's study one more facial expression in crowdfunding and see what happens. And I feel like it's gotten very incremental and we need some big ideas to move us forward. But I also think there are opportunities with technology now. We're doing a lot more sentiment analysis in writing. We're doing a lot more facial recognition of emotion, vocal recognition of emotion. We have a recent JBV on that with Tom Allison and some other folks. And so I think the opportunity is to recognize that people don't always know what emotions they're experiencing. And even if they know, they may not want to share them because there's a lot of social demand artifacts around that. And so we need to embrace technologies that can help us get at emotions in individuals and teams without actually just doing the traditional surveys and interviews. Those are good too, but we need to be more robust in our methodologies and our thinking about what's really happening among individuals. And the one other thing I'll say is we study one emotion. And we've also talked about this. We don't experience one emotion at a time. We're humans. We have a messy jumble of things going on, right? We're super excited while we're nervous. We're super unhappy that something failed, but also relieved. And we need to really figure out how to study combined emotions of various types for entrepreneurs to really understand their experience.
And you briefly talked about questionnaire studies. Do you think they still have a future in top journals, or is that gone?
No, I think they still have a purpose in top journals. I still do them myself, but I think they just are often combined now with many other technologies, whether that's field data followed up with a survey or field data followed up with an experiment, or we're seeing a lot more qual-quant combined. There's just a lot more robust combinations of methodologies to try to get at so-called truth, whatever that means.
And you hinted at sort of non-incremental studies, sort of more big picture studies. But as a reviewer and editor, what else do you look for in a paper? Like most of our audience is either new to entrepreneurship research or to publishing in entrepreneurship journals. How do they know what a reviewer or editor sort of looks for in a paper?
So I'll say a couple of things about this. One, all of the major journals right now have brilliant From the Editor series that tell you what they're looking for and help you craft. I require all of my students to read these. AMR, AMJ, JBV, ETP, all of them have these from the editors, editorials that talk about how do you develop theory, how do you write up discussion sections, how do you do qualitative work, how do you, all of those things, how do you frame a research question? So first of all, that's how you learn, is by reading what other people are doing. But second of all, what I'm looking for are big ideas. My most common rejections that I write for Journal of Management and previously for Journal of Business Venturing were, you are not contributing something new that we don't already know, or you're not theorizing in a way that creates new theory or new ideas. You're just borrowing from another field, adapting, applying, testing in a new domain, but that's not enough for the big journals. There's a lot of value in replication studies and replication across boundaries and different contexts. But the major journals in entrepreneurship and management, in my view, are looking for non-replication studies. They're looking for new theoretical ideas, as well as data to back them up if it's an empirical journal.
Okay, so before I open the floor to the audience for question, let me ask you another question, though, about this novelty versus replication thing. There is this ongoing discussion in the literature that the pendulum may be swinging too far towards, may have already swung too far towards novelty, and we may be publishing studies that are non-replicable. We may be. So does that sort of give you pause as a reviewer or editor in terms of, is this robust results that we are getting, or is this just novel, but this is not robust? Do you think about it? Is that something?
Yeah, I do think about it. I think where we see this coming out in our field is in certain journals that are now open to replication studies. So ETP, for example, Entrepreneurship Theory and Practice, has, many people don't know, 4 new ways to submit, and one of them is a replication study. They call it a research note, but they have 4 different types of research notes. Journal of Management now has something called Journal of Management Scientific Reports, which is a brand new thing that just launched about a year ago, maybe a year and a half. That is essentially you submit the front end of a paper with what you're going to test before you go collect your data, so that we aren't doing this hypothesizing after the results are known. A lot of the major journals, including AMJ, JAP, others, are requiring you to do online pre-registration of your data collection. So we're seeing a lot more, I would call it validity, a push towards validity of our results. So it isn't just, hey, I wrung this data out as much as possible to find something and tweaked it and find something interesting, because it's not only non-replicable, but it's actually unethical to do that. So I think we're seeing a push back on that, absolutely, which I think is a very good thing moving forward.
Okay, wonderful. Now I'm going to invite some questions from the participants, and then I'll go back to my questions. But Julia, do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Melissa. I enjoy reading your article about the nature of passion in entrepreneurship. So the article is mainly developed through a psychological perspective. But at the same time, in Vishal's article, they're taking the path, state of the heart of entrepreneurial emotion research. It also pointed out that future research should focus on develop a multi-level approach to entrepreneurial passion. So my general question is that it's doable to integrate the psychological approach to sociology approach. I asked this question because I was trained in sociology, but right now I'm doing strategy and entrepreneurship research. And my answer to my own questions, I think in your paper, in your AMR article, you implicitly answer the question, and the answer is yes, because I noticed that you cited the government's article, book, The Presentation of Self. So government is a well-known sociologist. And the presentation of self, the concept in my knowledge is actually part of his broader theory of socialization. So the key concepts from his book, from The Presentation of Self, is that he borrowed the concepts from drama, from theater, and it actually more focused on in sociology concept context. It actually more focused on front stage self and backstage self. So the socialization theory means that everyone should play well, should play well in his assigned role. If you don't play your role well, then this society cannot function well. So in organizational context, it means that you have to play your assigned role well, or your company, your firm, your startups cannot succeed.
So Julia, is there a question?
Yeah, my question is, did you see it's doable to integrate psychology and sociology approaches to entrepreneurial passion? And if yes, what is the possible study points? And here, I just want to point out that actually government's article is one possible starting point, and maybe Melissa will have other thoughts.
Yeah, so there's a lot of questions in there, so I'll try to hit the highlights. The first is, yes, the passion work has already been taken to the team level of analysis. And we published a theory paper in 2017, and there have been a number of empirical papers since then, not only from myself and colleagues, but also some other folks that have been really interesting. But also this idea of front stage, backstage, or emotion regulation is endemic across the entrepreneurship literature. We see this in emotion regulation work, but there's a whole separate stream. So there's a stream of research on passion entrepreneurs feel, with either themselves or within teams. And there's also this stream on what they display to other people, displayed emotion. And there's a Chen Yao and Kotha 2009 AMJ paper that came out just about the same time as our AMR came out. And those two things really took things off. And that one's much more about the passion that individuals show to potential investors. And there's a side stream on to potential employees. So absolutely. But there's also this idea that we can show lots of emotions on a front stage that are not real. Right? And we can feel a lot of emotions that we don't show. And so this whole idea of regulation and what are you pretending, what are you acting, and what's real, that's where I'm coming from and saying we need more robust methodologies to look at facial analysis and vocal analysis, because those can still be to some extent faked, especially vocal, but facial analysis can't be, right? We know Duchenne smiles, we understand this. And so that's where the really interesting stuff is going forward, I think, is looking at what's the persona we put on, or the role we adopt, but it's also the expression we adopt. And to Vishal's work on gender, I've done some things on gender too. It's actually quite different how men and women are supposed to express passion to investors. And women are punished, for example, for expressing passion to investors, and men are rewarded for it. So there's some really interesting sort of multiple dimension dynamics occurring in the literature that I think we need more work on.
Yeah, thank you, Lianza. I think it's also possible to integrate. It seems like it is also possible to integrate this line of research into AI, the hottest topic.
Absolutely.
You know.
Thank you, Julia. Rai, do you have a question?
Thank you, professors, for your time. Hi, Melissa. So I have a couple of questions. I'll try to be quick. First is regarding your JBB 2005 paper, the parent metaphor paper. So actually, I share the passion for passion research, as in my area of interest is also entrepreneurial passion. And actually, my first paper in JBB Insights came on the parent metaphor. I was trying to connect how the entrepreneurial passion shifts to entrepreneurial addiction. On that front, I wanted to ask that since you have been also writing a lot of theory papers, and I have a somewhat toxic passion towards writing theory papers, we haven't seen much of metaphor theorizing by metaphor kind of papers. Is there a reason behind that? Because how I understand theorizing by metaphor, just the way you did it, is that we know a lot of things about a particular metaphor, for example, baby, and then we try to comprehend through thought experiments that can be extrapolated to a particular construct that we don't know much about, and then future studies build upon it. So, but we don't see that often in the AMR article. Is there a reason behind it, and how was your experience in that 2005 paper in the review process? This is my first question. My second question is...
Rai, hold on. People will forget the question. So let her answer the first question, and then we'll come back to you in order.
Sure.
And when he says people, he means me. I'll forget the question if there's too many questions. No, it's totally good. It's probably true. So the 2005 article was really, really fun one for me. It was actually my first publication ever accepted, even though it's not the first one that came out, because JBV at the time had about a 4-year backlog on accepted papers coming out in print. So this one is going to tie back to the advice I'm going to give you guys later, which is go to conferences and put yourselves out there and be risky. So that JBV metaphor paper came from an Academy of Management doctoral consortium. I don't know how many of you have attended doctoral consortium of some form, but we were all sitting around a table. It was the end of day 2. We're all like super exhausted and getting a little bit silly. And a guy named Venkat, who I bet you know who is by now, but he was the editor of JBV at the time. And he got up and talked about what is entrepreneurship and what is the domain of entrepreneurship. And again, this was in the late 1990s, right? So it was a long time ago. Come up with an explanation for the field of entrepreneurship at your table and then present to the room. We got silly. We started talking about dating and marriage and do you have babies before you get married and do all these things. We just got silly. And I got elected to present it to the room. And I did. And everybody thought it was hysterical. But then Venkat said, if you guys write that up well, I'll publish it in JBV. I don't know if it was a bluff. I don't know if it was real, but we said, let's do it. So we wrote it up. I volunteered to take lead simply because I had lost the game of not it on who had to present it, even though I was super uncomfortable at the time doing that. And we submitted it. We went through the publication process. He was our editor, went through the publication process in like maybe 3 rounds. I don't really remember at the time. It's a long time ago. But that's where that paper came from. I think we don't see them a lot in journals simply because it's not just here's a metaphor that might be useful for future theorizing. It's here's a metaphor that nobody's really articulated well before, and then mapping that to what are the specific areas of research that this can help us understand, the phenomena that can help us understand, and research that we can launch from it. So it's not enough just to have a metaphor. You have to do more than that, I think, if that helps.
And Melissa, you mentor a lot of PhD students. What is your advice to them in terms of doing theory articles? Because I've heard sort of mixed views on that. Any thoughts?
Yeah, well, do you want my AMR hat or you want my Melissa hat? Because those are maybe a little different.
I think Melissa hat.
Yeah, some people say a PhD student should never write a theory paper. I disagree. I think, in fact, in my PhD seminar, I teach a seminar on the psychology of entrepreneurship, and everyone has to write a theory paper. It's a whole different discipline. I think it's harder in some ways because you have to have persuasive logic and argumentation. Your contribution is your paper. So you can't rely on a really cool data set or a cool context. You have to really have something novel to say and something robust to say about it. And often at the PhD stage, especially first year, second year students, they end up looking like the front end of a nice empirical paper, which is okay. But then I can give them feedback to say, if you want this to be a theory paper, this is what you would need to do. And so I think it's a good exercise to try to do it. AMR runs idea development workshops around the world. And if you haven't been to one of those, you need to get to one of those, because they don't do paper development workshops, they do idea development workshops. And that's because the hardest part of a theory paper is what's the nugget of an idea that you've got.
Wonderful. Ashwini, do you want to go next?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So my question to Professor Cardon, it's a very small question. So regarding this metaphor paper of yours. So my question is, can you really teach parenting to parents? I mean, you've equated it with entrepreneurship with parenthood. So can you really teach parenting to parents? And I don't know what the answer is. Then perhaps the second part of my question would be, is ignorance the first step to anything? I mean, when you, is it the mediator to comprehend learning? How do I phrase it? I mean, maybe I'm phrasing it wrong, but the first question stands.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. So you're basically saying, can we teach entrepreneurs how to do entrepreneurship? Can we teach parents how to parent? I think some people have a natural instinct towards these things, and I think some people do not. One of the biggest pieces of feedback we got in the review process with that metaphor paper was that not all parents are good parents. And not all entrepreneurs are good entrepreneurs. Some of them are terrible. Some parents abuse their children. Some entrepreneurs beat their businesses and employees into the ground. So let's be very realistic about what we can and can't do. What I believe firmly is that we can help those that aspire to be entrepreneurs understand what they're getting themselves into. It's my HR background, my human resources background, but I believe strongly in a realistic job preview, which means we have all these undergraduate students say, yay, I want to start a business, but don't really understand what it takes to do it. And that's our job. That's our job, to teach them, here is what you're going to need to know. It's a toolkit, but it's not writing business plans and doing economic forecasts and customer discovery. Yeah, that's important. But it's also really important to understand part of this is really going to stink, and you're going to be lonely and depressed and deal with failure and struggle, and you're going to have marital issues because you're spending so much time in your business. And we really need to prepare them to understand those things. I think that's super, super important.
That's okay. That's okay. What I meant is, so people are basically ignorant about what to do next. I mean, whether it's parenting or whether it's entrepreneurship. So what I mean to say is ignorance the mediating variable, which actually a kind of a emotional decision. Something is happening somewhere. I mean, which leads up to emotion and then positive emotions or negative emotions, and then a longer journey towards passion. So we all start with being ignorant, is it?
Yeah, but forewarned is forearmed, right? If you know what might be coming, you haven't had the experiences yet of those emotions or whatever it is, but you know what might be coming, so you can help prepare yourself for it.
Wonderful. And Ashwini, I put a quote from the 2005 paper in the chat box where they talk about parenting's passion, identification, overprotectiveness, abuse, something we discussed in the lead up to this session. But Oscar, you want to ask next?
Yes, thank you, Professor Gupta. Thank you, Professor Cardon, for this session for that I find very rich. My question is quite is divided in two. The first one is regarding your paper about in where you have the dimensions of the passion, because as I understand, you have identified two dimensions: the intensity positive feeling and the identity centrality, that for me are different aspects. One is more related to emotions expression and the other one more with decision making. So what are your thoughts on that? What type of theories can you advise us to measure those different dimensions? Because I consider that both of them are separated in terms of what are the goals that you try to obtain when you express yourself in an enthusiastic, emotional way, and the fact that you are completely engaged with your idea, based on your identity and your belief, are two separate things that are related in your construct. So what are the theories that you can advise us to move forward in measuring this?
Yeah, great question. I completely agree with you. There are two different dimensions, but I would say they're extremely related in that what we argue is not just that you have these positive feelings you express, but what you have positive feelings for are internalized into your identity. So, I get excited when the sun is shining, but that isn't any part of my identity, right? So the difference is, if I'm going to measure positive feelings of passion specifically, I have to know what they're for. I can't just measure how happy are you today, how excited are you today, how enthusiastic were you in your presentation. I have to measure how excited are you about something specific related to your venture. So we have a 2013 JBV scale development paper where we developed a measure of passion. And I've been saying very loudly for the last 10 years, I want somebody to improve that scale. It is based on the 3 dimensions in the AMR paper that you guys read for this session, but there's so many more things that entrepreneurs can be passionate about. And we have a JBVI that actually explored qualitatively what different domains of passion might exist, but nobody's taken it, including me, nobody's taken that next step to measure positive, intense feelings for these different domains that are central to one's identity. So specific to your question, we need the positive feelings. We need to know what they're for, and we need to expand what they're for. And we need the identity centrality component. And there's a long legacy of history and research on identity that you can draw from for robust measures.
Perfect. Lucy, do you want to go next?
Thank you. I wonder, can this be applied at the community level? Because I see some literature talking about community level meaning creation. For example, rural tourism, they use different business strategies to use the foreign resources differently. It leads to different economic future and also different environmental future. So also talk about authenticity of the landscape meaning in this rural tourism. I know in human resources, there is also authenticity is a big thing. And also, do you think this is there's a linkage? Do you think there's possibility apply the thing at a community level and also maybe some part cannot be explained and bringing adjacent disciplines theories to have something new coming here? Do you think that is a possible route ahead?
Yeah, absolutely. So I heard two different questions in there. You guys are getting very creative about how to embed multiple questions so Vishal doesn't cut off you after one question. So authenticity, absolutely. And this idea of how does what I feel compared to what I show other people I feel. And that authenticity, to the earlier question about front stage, backstage, should be part of this. And I've talked about that in a few places. But yes, nobody's actually, to my knowledge, nobody has the measure simultaneously of what a person feels and what a person shows in terms of passion expression, which would be the way to get at authenticity. What's the match or mismatch between those two? At a community level, I think it's the same construct that we're just going on up from individual to team to community or organization. We do have a big body of literature on organizational identity. There's a big body of literature on team affect, or organizational affect, team emotional climate, for example, psychological safety, those kinds of constructs. And I don't see why organization level measures couldn't be adapted to a community as well. But you'd have to be really specific about what is that community's identity that people are passionate for in varying degrees. So communities of practice might be defined around a certain commonality, for example. And so you might measure feelings for that community of practice. But I've got a couple of papers where we studied team passion and then individual passion, and they're not the same thing. So if my team, and I'll give you my easiest example is an academic environment. I worked at a teaching school for 13 years while I was very passionate about research. So most of my passion work came out while I was at a teaching school, not at University of Tennessee. I've only been there for 5 years. But the school was passionate about teaching. They were not passionate about research. I was passionate about both teaching and research. And so there was a slight mismatch between what I identified as a researcher and was passionate about that and what the community or organization identified as. And so we need to look at those kinds of mismatches if we're going to study this at a community level.
That's so interesting because my background is business geography, and when we study community, community identity is social meaning creation. Authenticity is about the community authenticity. For example, tourism, we create something for tourists, but that's not the real community, and we are selling something which isn't really real. It's like in human resources also talk about that as personal level. And do you think there's like the linkage, like potential to do so?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a great area of research.
That's great to know. Thank you so much.
Mandy, do you want to go next?
Yes. Hi, Melissa. Thank you so much for providing your knowledge and sharing that with us. I have a question in terms of passion. Do you see that as a very underlying drive assumptions for entrepreneurship? So for example, if we were to distinguish entrepreneurship into the normal entrepreneurship we see or necessity entrepreneurship, where some people are not really passionate about to start the entrepreneurship, but they were for some reasons forced into entrepreneurship, such as for necessity reason. How do you see passion playing the role in that context? So do you see any opportunities in researching that area?
Yeah, so I think there are two things here. I believe strongly that passion is not a requirement for success of entrepreneurs. Some entrepreneurs certainly are passionate. It makes life easier when you're passionate about what you do. You love what you do. You don't work a day in your life. That's nonsense. But in my opinion, that's nonsense. But it does make it easier to get through the hard parts when you're passionate. But not all successful entrepreneurs are passionate. Not all entrepreneurs are passionate, successful or not. And I think the context you bring up is a really important one in which people may not want to be an entrepreneur, but yet Michael Gilnick and Michael Friesa and some other folks, Michael Lex and some others have done research in which they've gone into communities in which people are necessity entrepreneurs. And they have it's the year 2017, maybe AMJ, that's I put in effort, therefore I am passionate. And so they're looking at people that start engaging in entrepreneurial action because they have to. And over time, they sort of go through the sense-making process where they rationalize it and say, well, I'm doing it. I'm spending all this time doing it. I must love it. And so they develop passion. Now, in that study, they didn't measure the identity component. To the earlier question about dimensions, they measure the enthusiasm component. But it does make sense when you do something and you engage in it over and over and over again, you develop feelings of attachment or enthusiasm or excitement about it. But do I think that's necessary? No. And do I think people have looked at that differently for necessity versus opportunity entrepreneurs? No. So maybe that's an opportunity to expand the passion research to say, to what extent does it exist? How does it form? When does it form? Under what conditions does it form? And does it matter if it forms for necessity entrepreneurs?
Okay, I have another related question. It just feels to me that this entire emotion or passion literature in entrepreneurship sort of require people to have a psychology root or micro individual level of analysis. If researchers were like the more quantitative type or who are more comfortable using archival data, do you see any opportunities or suggestions or those type of work is missing? If so, like any suggestions for that type of work?
So you can absolutely study this using quantitative methods and archival data. Keep in mind the entire body of literature on top management teams came out of strategy, where strategists like Don Hambrick said, there's people on top management teams, we need to understand people. And so they'd never really looked at the people components until they decided it was important and they looked at it. How do you do that? Well, one of it's going and finding the archival data that might have some measures or proxies of measures that you could use. So I have a paper on stress and emotion, for example, where my co-author Pankaj Patel came up with this brilliant data set. It was a health-based data set. It was self-employed people, not entrepreneurs, but it was basically health and wellness kinds of measures. And one of the things they measured was emotion. They measured positive affect. And so we were able to look at the health and wealth trade-offs for self-employment of it makes you happier, but it hurts your health. It makes you richer, your income level, but it hurts your health. And positive affect can help those things. So it's really about sort of exploring what are the data sets out there. Do they have measures they can use? So that's archival data, but there's also a lot of data you can scrape now. I mean, the famous Facebook experiment where they took scraped data unknown to people getting their data scraped and analyzed emotional content. I'm using sentiment analysis. Please don't do that with Facebook and don't do it without IRB or whatever your human rights protection approvals are where you are. But there's a ton of research. I've got a project right now where we scraped Reddit data to study emotion. So there's a lot of opportunity for those of you with better quant skills.
Let's go. Thank
Wonderful. Vetri, do you want to go next?
Sure, Professor. Hello, Professor Cardon. Good morning. I wrote to you during the application season, and you had replied back saying that we could either meet at Tennessee or if not, we could meet in some other forum. Happy to meet you here. So in your 2009 paper, you approach passion from identity and say that passion arises because somebody has some identity or perceive some identity, right? So could it be the other way around too? Could passion create identity, say, or could it be like a cycle? Interest in something turns into passion, and then passion makes you create an identity for yourself, and that identity further adds more passion for the associated activities. Is this a right way to think about it? And then I think people.
Let's keep it to one question at a time because we have a whole we have a line of people waiting to ask questions.
So this is the main question. That was a sub question. The one that I'm going to ask now is the main question.
Okay, go ahead. Ask quickly though.
Thank you. So I think people reinforce or influence how identities are created, right? So when someone wants to change their identity, right, they may want to surround themselves with people who are reinforcing the identity that you want to create for yourself, or there might be you might also be surrounded by doubters whom you want to remove yourself away from, right? So is this and in entrepreneurship also a lot of these transitions happen. Say an employee wants to become an entrepreneur, so there is an identity change. So identity change, and how do they manage passion while changing their identity? Is this a good thing to study?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. We have a study right now where we're looking at how does passion form for nascent entrepreneurs and accelerators. So our passion paper that you read, the 2009, presumes people are already entrepreneurs. Well, if you don't yet have the identity of an entrepreneur, you're an aspirant entrepreneur. It's an aspirant identity, and there's a whole literature on aspirant identities. What happens when your belief in, well, you guys are, many of you doctoral students are early in your career. I want to be an academic. Well, I keep getting a rejection of my papers. Does that mean I shouldn't be an academic? How do I continue to love my ideal of becoming an academic when I'm getting disconfirming feedback that it's not going so well as I want it to? And so this is what we're studying now in terms of passion formation for nascent entrepreneurs. It's an absolute fantastic opportunity to study this longitudinally over time. How does it develop? How do we shake people's passion? Does it change? If my passion is for my product and I have to pivot my product through customer discovery, does that mean I'm no longer passionate, or can I just transfer my passion to this new product or this evolution? There's all kinds of questions here that we don't know the answers to. And that's what I mean by getting much more rich and interesting questions. How's it unfold over time with other things happening around us? So great. Yeah, keep working on that.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Sivad, you want to go next? Sivad? Oscar?
Yes, Professor Gupta, thank you. Professor Cardon, I have only one last question that was my second question, and is regarding the rhetoric of Aristotle that you mentioned in one of your papers. There is a balance between different dimensions in Aristotle, that you have the emotional part, the logic part, and the credibility of the trust. So you have these three dimensions that are playing a role into the rhetoric. So my question is, with experience, because you mentioned the experience in your 2009 paper, do you think that the experience gives legitimacy and decrease the level of the relevance of passion and emotions into the entrepreneurial process?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a great empirical question. I don't have an answer to empirically. I would say speculatively, I think experience matters, but I don't think it decreases it. I know entrepreneurs that are on their fourth or fifth venture that are still just as excited about being an entrepreneur as the first. And I can tell you, having been an academic for 20 plus years, the rejections still hurt, some of them more than others. That's all about emotional investment and identity connection. So the resonance for me of the theory of passion applies to our own careers as well as academics. Some papers were closer to, some were further away to identity-wise. Feelings wise, and so it makes a difference. So I think that's another area where we should be studying. How does experience change it? But I would never presume it's going to be a linear change. I would never presume it's just going to get less impactful with more experience or more impactful. I think it's really just a question. What are the conditions under which entrepreneurs over time with more experience feel more passion, less passion, whatever that might be? I think that's an interesting question.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Sivad, do you want to go now?
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Thank you, Ms. Melissa, for the presentation. I'm actually asking for advice. I'm the country delegate for the GUESS. The GUESS is the Global University Entrepreneurial Spirit Student Survey. And we are measuring mostly the entrepreneurial intention among university students all over the world. So we have data from almost 52 countries. And I wanted to ask if it's a good strategy to start from the data to hypothesizing and investigate and analyzing or investigating situations or let's say paths related to passion, because when we are collecting the data, we are not just limited to the entrepreneurial intention. We have the template in which we have measurement for the passion, for the identity, for the entrepreneurial orientation, for the intention, for the dark triad dimensions, for the personality tree dimensions. So is it a good strategy to relate these concepts together from the data to the model? Or it's better to go from the model, theorizing, modeling, and then going to collect data?
So let's be perfectly honest with one another. And I know this will end up on YouTube, so I'm gonna be perfectly honest with the entire field. The reality is it's iterative. We should start with a model before we've ever decided what measures to collect in that data, right? and we should have ideas about what we're going to find in hypotheses and go test them. The reality is it doesn't always work out that way, and you can't always get published with non-findings, although as Vishal mentioned earlier, that's changing, which I think is good. What often actually happens is you go investigate one question or one model and something shows up that's surprising or interesting. So you do more analysis, post hoc analyses, robustness tests to figure out what's really going on. That may lead to yet another paper and another model. So it is an iterative process, even with quantitative deductive research. Inductive research, of course, goes all the way around, where you start with data and phenomenon and people and informants, and you figure out what is the theoretical sort of connections among what's happening or processes through which things are happening. But even in deductive research, which it sounds like what you're doing, since you've already got scales out there, it's going to be iterative. But I would never just go collect a whole bunch of scales and see what's significant. That's what we would call bad science. So don't do that.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, actually, what I'm doing for the entrepreneurial intention, which is my focus actually for my dissertation, is modeling, then collecting data. That's why I'm involved in gas. But I just thought that maybe I can, after this session, I just wanted to see if I can exploit the data that I have last year, because we had already closed the data collection. If I can use it maybe for the replication of an article or a research paper. Sometimes I have some thoughts on, okay, I can maybe replicate the same model for different regions, because sometimes different countries or different regions can give another results or different findings. So
we can discuss this issue later because we are on tight time. So let's move to the next question. Shikha.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much. My question actually came from one of the readings that we had today, and this was on the metaphor paper on parenting. And one of the things that caught my attention was the foster parenting that was mentioned, and the example that was given was of an investor or a venture capital coming in and replacing the founder, the entrepreneur over there. The thought that came in, and this was pertaining to the passion paper that I had just read before this, was that the founder entrepreneur brings in a lot of passion in the way in which he runs the business. And there is no way in which this particular passion then would be, I mean, we have not been able to measure and see that whether this passion then gets transmitted within the business to the employees and the others. So if the founder is replaced with another person, wouldn't the organization be impacted? And how can, an investor or a venture capital fund measure the fact that how much is the contribution in terms of passion of a founder partner over there? The idea was from Steve Jobs and his being removed and coming back over there. Yeah, thank you.
So there's a really interesting literature called on something called founder imprinting. So what is the imprint a founder has on the venture? And part of that comes through culture, part of that comes through HR practices, what they've set up right from the beginning. Diane Burton, I can't come up with all the names. I don't know if Vishal can, but look up founder imprinting, and there's a really interesting work there. It hasn't been looked at in terms of passion yet. What happens when that founder leaves and somebody else replaces them? Is that imprinting still in place? I've seen a paper under review on that, but not actually come out in a journal yet. So it's not my work, it's somebody else's. So I think this is a really interesting question again of one, contagion to employees. There's a bit on that. Contagion to employees either through the hiring process or after they've been hired. But then what happens if that contagion's happened or not, and then the founder's removed? I don't know of much work that's done that. That's really interesting.
Thank you.
Wonderful. And we did talk about that in the pre-session, Melissa, where we said these are all good ideas to examine. We'll just take two last questions, and Melissa, then I'll move to the last couple of questions I have. But let me check with you first. Melissa, I know we said 40 minutes. Do you have about 10 more minutes?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm good.
Perfect. Thank you. So Antijoni and then Rai.
Yeah, thank you, actually, Vishal, and for this excellent the workshop, and thank you so much for your time, Melissa. I have studies about the creative industries. And my simple question, do you think is appropriate to use passion or about the creative entrepreneur, means entrepreneurs in creative industries, or we need to take it as a granted because without the passion, you cannot be in this field?
Oh, it's a great question. I think the question in your context is, what's the passion for? Is it passion for being an artist, for being a creative? Is it passion for any particular work of art that you've created, which might make it hard to let it go? I mentioned my sister's an entrepreneur. She did high-end cakes, those beautiful cakes that are all works of art, really. And the biggest problem she had was watching people cut it the first time. Right? So you're destroying her masterpiece. So what is it that creative entrepreneurs are passionate about? And how do they sustain that passion when they sell their creative work, or when they have trouble
Not sell
selling their creative work? Or yeah, exactly.
Because actually this is, they say I'm passionate, but
for what?
They don't sell anything.
Right. So in that case, it'd be I'm a passionate creator. When we see this in what we would call inventor, right? I love inventing a product. I'm actually doing an interview later this afternoon to talk about a company that went absolutely haywire because they couldn't get the engineer to let go of the invention enough to pivot it when the market demanded it be changed. So I think there's a lot of dynamics that you can look at in terms of what is the object of passion and how does it affect behavior, commercialization behavior, letting go behavior, change behavior for creative entrepreneurs.
Great. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. Rai, you get the next question.
Thank you. Sorry for persisting with the questions. Perhaps I'm passionate about it. Sorry. Okay. So you have written several AMR pieces, several conceptual papers in JBV as well, and now you are also you would be also a reviewer for many of the articles that would have been published. What is your opinion? For example, in empirical pieces, we can envision that, you know, if certain robustness checks don't work out, or there's some issues other than that, then after 1 R&R, there are some rejections. But in a conceptual theory paper, when the editor already likes your idea, what are the reasons that after R&R people get rejections? Because I've heard that AMR sometimes is a tricky beast. I've heard it from a couple of top scholars that AMR is a tricky beast. So what is your opinion? What kind of issues prop up? So yeah.
Yeah, so I'm not an editor there yet, so I'll only speak of it as a reviewer and author at AMR or with theory papers in general. The challenge is in the review process, people can ask for anything. Have you considered this theory? Have you considered that theory? And you can't say, I don't have that data, so I can't expand. So sometimes papers lose focus in a revision because you're trying to do everything the reviewers have told you to do, which is a really terrible idea with a theory paper, because it gets too big. I mean, you guys read my 2009, that model is pretty robust. My 2017 AMR, that model is over the top robust, meaning busy, complicated. And it was hard to bound it to something meaningful and connect all the pieces in a meaningful way. And that's where you lose revisions of theory papers, is when you're trying to do too much, or if you pare it down so much that it's a really little idea and it's not enough. And it's really hard because there's a sweet spot and you can't really find that sweet spot until you're working through the process. My best advice for that is to read a lot of AMRs or theory papers in general. And if you can get your hands on somebody that's willing to share how their paper has evolved through the process, that is one of the most meaningful things you can do, is see, what did it look like when it was presented at a conference? What does it look like when it's first submitted to the journal? What were the reviews? How did they revise it? Like, just to walk through that whole process on a paper that's been published, because what you read that's been published is not at all what somebody first submitted. It's not the same paper. It's the same idea, but it's not the same paper. I still have a friend that says they preferred what you read as my 2009 AMR paper when we presented it and won an award at Academy of Management in 2005 for it. They still like the paper in 2005 better than what was accepted and published in AMR. And that part of that paper got cut out and is gone. It'll never see the light of day. Yes, somebody just put it in a comment. I just saw it pop up in this chat. AMR has a bridge reviewer program. If you are not aware of that program, you need to be aware of it, and you need to become a bridge reviewer, because it teaches you how to review, but it also teaches you how does a paper change throughout the entire process. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Melissa, what you just said also brought up something else that is interesting. You said it won the 2005 AOM award, eventually got published in 2009, but that does mean the paper was being developed and rewritten and developed for 4 or 5 years. Would that be correct?
Yes. So the paper idea, the story I told you about when the senior person came to me about it, was 2002. So we presented it at the Babson conference in 2004. We presented at the Academy of Management in 2005. We submitted it in 2006, and then it took us 3 years to get it through. That one went 5 rounds at AMR.
And that speaks to something I think all junior scholars need to understand, that this is a process that takes time and patience. But let me come to my last 2 questions, because I know we have limited time with you. Can you tell us about one passion entrepreneurship or emotion entrepreneurship paper that you're working on these days? How did you get the idea? How did you put together the team? What were the steps you did?
Yeah, this one was tricky because obviously I love this area of research. So I have taken a turn in the last 5 years or so away from the positive psychology stuff towards the darker stuff. Not because I'm a more darker person, but because I think the realities and challenges for entrepreneurs are suffering. And not so much in Dean Shepard's view of suffering, but depression, loneliness. I've got a project on loneliness right now using Reddit data, as I mentioned. But the one I want to talk about actually involves Alabama. And that is, we have a PhD student in her 2nd year of the program who is from Ukraine. A year ago, we all know what happened in Ukraine in February 24th, 2022, where the war escalated significantly. She was in her 1st year of her PhD program. So imagine the trauma on that individual. And we all, as her faculty, were very concerned about her. We dragged her down to Alabama in March of that year because they do this Southeast Entrepreneurship Conference. And she was really struggling because her family was still in Ukraine and in danger. And so we talked to a few people at Alabama just about, so sorry, she's not fully present. Here's what's going on. And after the conference, a faculty member there, Peter Harms, reached out and he said, listen, he's a psychologist. He studies PTSD for the US Army quite a bit, and he's very, very good at getting grants. And he asked us if we wanted some help getting some money to study what was happening in Ukraine. And we said, yes. So I learned quite a lot about how one applies for NSF, National Science Foundation grants in the US. We applied for a grant, something called a rapid grant, which means there's an urgent issue we need to study now. We got it. And for the last year, we've been studying the impact of the war in Ukraine on civilians, including entrepreneurs. So we collected quantitative and qualitative data starting last summer. We have 3 waves of data. The 3rd wave's coming in now. Natalia's been doing interviews there over Zoom, but also I will say officially that she's been in Europe doing interviews because she's not allowed to be in Ukraine, of course, because it's dangerous. But she has gone home to visit her family. And we're also collecting significant quantitative data. We have over 16,000 respondents in longitudinal data from Ukraine. So what are we studying there? This is where, this is do what I say, not what I do. We put together some scales that were robust to try to understand mental health, well-being, ill-being, stress, coping, trauma, resilience, those kinds of things. We're still kind of figuring out what do we have in the data, simply because we did not expect 16,000 people to respond. So right now we're carving sort of a mental health story out that will go to a journal in June. Natalia will be, the student will be presenting some of the qualitative interview data she's done on resilience trajectories of entrepreneurs at the Babson conference in 2 weeks, which is housed at, being held at University of Tennessee. I hope some of you are coming. And we have probably 3 or 4 other papers that will come out of this data collection. So that's what's taken up a whole lot of time right now in my world, but that's what's new.
And that's good for students to know, right? How does a student sort of go from tying their personal experience to a research project and so on, and then actually executing it, and so. But so now last question, Melissa, and I know we already passed the 1 hour mark. What's one advice you would offer to aspiring entrepreneurship researchers?
Be open to opportunities that make you uncomfortable. And I say that because I'm still doing this in my career. I mentioned the metaphor paper, the parenthood paper came out of me losing essentially and having to stand up and present when nobody wanted to do it, but that's led to an entire stream of work. Talking to a marketing professor outside of my department about a project just to give him my insights, being open to new opportunities. The Ukraine project, it's not anything I intended to study, but it came up because a war happened or escalated and the student needed help. So I think being open to opportunities and studying what's interesting to you. Please, please, please don't find your future research ideas in somebody else's future research section of their paper. I used to read those sections like, oh, I could do this because somebody else said we need to do it. No, no, no. Find what you care about and what you want to study and what's interesting to you, and put yourself out there and talk to people about your ideas. If you haven't read the paper by Holger Paetzel and Dean Shepard yet on lean scholarship, you need to read that paper on lean scholarship. And the idea is exactly what we teach in our entrepreneurship classes. Have a whole robust set of ideas you're playing with on your research stream and give them air, give them light, talk to people about them. Come to conferences and talk to strangers. I'm an introvert. I hate talking to strangers. I hate cocktail parties at conferences. They make me so uncomfortable. Even 30 years into this career as a senior faculty member, I hate them. But I still go and I still talk to strangers. So if you see me, please come talk to me and be my friend instead of a stranger. But this is how new ideas come up. This is how you find out what of your ideas resonate with other people. This is how you pivot your ideas and make them better. They aren't better sitting alone in your office writing. They're better. Thank you for that reference, Oscar. They're better when you air them and share them with other people. And that's how we improve our work, from Babson conference to Academy conference to submission to a journal and throughout the review process as well. You will feel attacked in the review process. People will tell you that your work is terrible and that you need to completely change it. And the initial reaction a lot of junior scholars have is to defend. I mean, heck, our dissertation defenses are called defenses. It's a bad word, right? It should be a discussion. Don't defend, figure out what you can learn, stand your ground on what you know is important, but figure out what you can learn from feedback you get, positive and negative.
Perfect. Thank you, Melissa. Every time I talk to you, I learn a lot, and today is no exception. Thank you for taking the time, generously answering everyone's questions, and I look forward to seeing you sometime.
Yeah, thank you all for being here. I loved your questions, and it was a great conversation. Have a great rest of the day, afternoon, evening, or night. Take care.